Hi, welcome to the Perception Lecture. Today we're going to move on from the specific and biological lessons you learned in the last two sensation lectures, and we're going to move into thinking about perception, particularly as you might expect in vision. So we start off today with a regular picture of just a wall. Just a wall, brick wall, nothing special to see here, right? It's got a little rock in it. One brick that's maybe a little sawed down on the top, maybe just eroded with time. But actually, what you're really looking at here is a wall into which someone has shoved a cigar. See it now? Once I highlight it, there it is. If you see it now, you're probably finding it hard to unsee it. So that process of not knowing it's there, thinking it was just rocks and bricks, and then the follow-up process of not being able to unsee the cigar once you know it's there, are all part of a phenomenon called perceptual set, which is going to determine a lot of what we talk about today. So these perceptual set learning outcomes are based in a couple of sort of smaller chunks. The first one is I'm going to talk about how small eye movements are related to forgetting you have a hat on. We'll talk about the sets of principles at work in a classic image based on the theories of Gestalt psychologists. So these are called the Gestalt principles. And then we'll reinterpret certain examples through the lens of embodied cognition to kind of wrap up the sensation and perception section. So to put all this under the same umbrella, you could say that perception is constructed by the senses and the mind moment to moment, and thus it is not a perfect representation of your sensory experience. All three of these are examples of situations in which your sensory experience is informed somehow by your mind, thus meaning that the senses and the perception of those senses are not 100% exactly the same. Before we dig in, think about if you can remember the difference between sensation and perception. I've just kind of said one version of it. Think about whether you can remember those two definitions from a couple of videos ago. Maybe pause the video and see if you can generate them yourself out loud right now. You'll remember that sensation is the interaction between your sensory receptors and the world. So the actual physical process of light waves hitting your retina, pressure pressing on your skin, sound waves moving into your eardrums, smells entering your nose, and tastes colliding with your taste buds. Perception, by contrast, is your mind's interpretation of those sensations. It is those experiences of light hitting the retina, of pressure on the skin, as you actually see them, or feel them, or in the case of eardrum sounds, hear them. We've talked a little bit about bottom-up and top-down processing. Bottom-up typically refers to a basic task or skill or faculty of the mind. Anytime you're doing something from the basics to the more complex, we call that bottom-up. And a top-down type of processing refers to an instance in which some kind of theory you have, or your mind subconsciously has, about the world fills in information surrounding the pattern of stimuli that it sees or hears or feels in that moment. So based on everything you know about what let's just stick with vision, what you've seen before, your mind can fill in the image of what's around you. Basically, the way your optic nerve's blind spot is filled in is through a top-down process. Your brain assumes it knows what's in there. For me at this point, what's right in my blind spot is probably some spot along the wall, and my brain can fill in what that spot probably looks like. And since I'm not focusing on it with my fovea, I don't even really notice it. But when I move my finger, like we did in the demo in the most recent video, to the spot where it goes away, that is me attempting to use or rather revealing my blind spot through a bottom-up process. I've said before that that's not an exact characterization of where these things happen in the brain, but it's actually kind of close. You could maybe think of the bottom also as the back and the top as the front. So kind of diagonally in that direction maybe would help you sort of think about bottom up and top down physically. But the reason I'm bringing them up again is that when you combine bottom up processing, the information hitting your senses, your sensory receptors, and top down information, the things your mind already knows about the situation you're in, those two things combine to create your perception. So it is, yes, informed by what's in front of you, your perception is, but it's also informed by what you already know, or what you may have expected, or what you thought you might see in that situation. This is a really old concept in psychology, actually. You can trace it all the way back to the proposal of a likelihood principle by von Helmholtz many, many moons ago. He wrote that we will perceive the object that is the most likely cause of our sensory stimulation. So if you see something, for example, that could be any number of possible situations, your brain will decide for you that it is the most likely of those situations, whichever it's seen the most frequently in the past. So this is the reason that when I draw a 2D representation of a cube on a sheet of paper, it looks like a cube to me, or to you, because we've seen cubes. You don't really see those sort of weird diamondy shapes with sticks sticking off the bottom of them. You see cubes. And so your brain sees that image and says this is probably a representation of a cube in a slightly new way. Von Helmholtz ran lots of studies to show these kinds of effects as well. In one, participants were shown a kitchen scene, and then there were briefly flashed pictures after of a drum, a mailbox, and a loaf of bread. Most subjects could identify the loaf of bread, which of course is appropriate to the kitchen scene, but couldn't identify the mailbox or drum, even though they were all shown for the same really short split-second amount of time. I don't know if that's probably not a von Helmholtz study, but it's one that's run based on his original idea of the likelihood principle. This relationship between the information hitting your receptors and your brain's interpretation of that information is really interesting. It moves around. It depends on the sense, and it depends on how much information you know going into a situation, where exactly they cross over, how much information comes from one versus the other to develop into what you actually experience inside your mind. And that relationship, I think, is shown really nicely, but made even perhaps more confusing by a really great example of the combination of two senses. I show this every year in Intro Psych, and it still works on me too. So if you were unable to watch that video, if it gets blocked and I have to delete it, I will say that the McGurk effect is a really interesting piece of sensory interaction. So what happens is, in the study, they play a sound over and over and over. The sound is a person saying ba. So they say ba, 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 over and over and over. But what changes is you see different images alongside the ba's. So if you see the accurate image of somebody making a B sound with their lips, so you see actual ba, then you hear and see ba. But if the image is changed to somebody saying fa, so, and especially if it's a really intense version of it where they totally bring their own lower lip in and say fa, that really messes with our ability to hear ba, because the information hitting our ears doesn't match the information hitting our eyes. It looks like we should be hearing fa, but we're hearing ba. And so what our senses do is kind of integrate those two pieces of information to give you like a softer kind of puh sound coming out of the person's mouth. It's really, really interesting. And again, an unstoppable effect. It happens no matter how much you know about it. The guy in the video says he's been researching it 25 years, and still works on him, and I'll say that it also works on me after using this example in intro psych for several years now. And so the reason this happens is because our perception is kind of all at once all the time. We maybe focus on one or another of our senses in a given moment, but the entirety of our perception is actually more like all of our senses folded together. As I'm sitting here talking to you, I can feel the chair under me, I can feel what I'm doing with my hands, I see the computer screen and the camera, and I hear myself talking. And that doesn't feel like four different things happening to me. It feels like it's one holistic perception of my experience in this moment. And that's critical, right? If there were 5 things going on in your mind at all times, it would be really confusing to try to behave and act normally in the world. So it is crucial that our senses interact for these reasons. It also helps because sometimes we can get extra information from one sense to help inform the other. So this is the situation shown on the screen here. An older clip, no doubt, that is actually made even more sensible by things like FaceTime being so all over the place in 2020. But back in 2004, they ran some studies showing that when a hard of hearing person was made a phone call, if the phone call was paired with a sort of digitized face that made some of the mouth movements that they were hearing on the screen in front of them, they became easier to understand. And maybe you've experienced the reverse of this. So probably you've experienced this as people sort of cut in and out on video whenever you're trying to video chat. That makes things really confusing because the image you're seeing stops or the image you're seeing becomes unclear. Maybe you've experienced it in the moments. By the way, sometimes my video freezes on these lecture recordings, and so when that happens, I just remove myself from the slide so that it's not distracting. Maybe you've noticed in those moments that sometimes it's harder to tell what I'm saying. Maybe you've noticed it during the COVID-19 pandemic, in that now not only is it harder to hear each other through masks, but we also can't see each other's mouths anymore. So we can't have that extra piece of helpful interpretive information that is watching somebody's mouth move while they talk. So it's really crucial, this instance of sensory interaction, and it really informs, I think, our definition of and our understanding of what perception is. In another clear example of perception, our bodily sensations are typically pretty seamlessly blended with our perception and our understanding and our cognition and our sort of lived experience. So if you've never heard of this, I'll highly encourage you to head to the second link below this video to be introduced to Dr. Simone Schnall of the University of Cambridge, who will give you a kind of interesting introduction to the idea of our bodily sensations, kind of sixth sense. Her study sounds a little like voodoo to me at first glance. I'd be curious to hear whether it has replicated since the original finding, but it is an interesting display of maybe the really extreme version of just how deeply ingrained in our physical bodies our understanding of the world is. Other people call this proprioception, and I'll share with you the story of a man who lost his feeling of his haptic sense, his body's sensations. He couldn't feel where his body was around him. He couldn't tell how he was moving. You've maybe had a little of this experience, like say you lean on your arm wrong long enough, or you wake up from a nap and your arm's asleep, and then when you try to move it, you find that it sort of flings itself around a little bit because you don't have full control over all the muscles. This man had that experience with his entire body. It's quite a story. I'll just show you a little bit. Cutting back, it won't let me show the video this way, so I'm going to link to it underneath. That'll be the third link in the description. I recommend you check out that interesting story from BBC. Another interesting suggestion made by the existence of perception is that it could be potentially possible to perceive something that is below your absolute threshold of sensation. And what that means is you would not be able to necessarily say, yes, I saw that picture show up on the screen in front of me and it was a race car, but we could see some reliable cognitive effects of you having been exposed to the race car. And so that process means that you didn't have the sensory experience of seeing the thing. It did not reach your absolute threshold of seeing, of vision, but we still absorb some interesting information from it. And the answer to this question is yes, you can. You can perceive something below your absolute threshold of sensation. They are reliable and interesting effects, yet small. So, a couple examples here. If the word up flashes before an arrow appears that tells you to make a move to the right, your movement will be altered, even if you didn't notice the word up, if it wasn't on screen long enough for you to actively sense it and notice it and think about it. You'll see people, so if there is no up flash, people will move directly to the right. If there is an up before their command to go right, you'll see them kind of start up and then correct themselves and go to the right. There's also data showing that if you see a word flashed once really, really quickly, you'll process it more quickly than you would have when you see it long enough that you can actually process it. So the example would be like you're watching your way through a list of words. The word bagel pops up and disappears before you can even understand it. And the task, let's say, is to identify whether the thing is made of bread. So then you see the word butter and you go no. You see the word sourdough and you go yes. You see the word salad and you go no. And then you see bagel. You'll say yes to bagel faster than you said yes to sourdough because you've seen it flash very quickly just before. Turns out you'll also be faster for related words, depending. So if maybe after bagel I showed you donut or bialy, or my example would be chamele, then you might also identify those things a little faster. The effects are also really short-lasting. So if you flash bagel and then you show 10 other words before you see bagel again, it may not actually have one of these what we call priming effects. And so that's kind of the reason that these subliminal images don't really work. You may have heard of some of this going on in marketing before. Maybe you've heard that popcorn shows up in the corner of a movie screen every now and then to remind people to go get popcorn. Or here's an example where $1 used to appear inside the lettuce of the 99-cent KFC snacker, presumably to remind people that it was only $1. This kind of effect, again, these subliminal messaging effects are really, really short-lasting. So maybe it affects somebody for a moment in the moment, but unless they get up right then and go and buy the KFC snacker, it isn't really going to affect them long-term. Some of the really cool versions of these effects are studied by a team I worked near in Victoria, who built this tool that they called the Grasposaurus, for which the instruction is when you see a hand on the screen make a particular grip, you should respond with that grip on the appropriate implement in front of you. So there's a cylinder you can pretend like you're going to pick up, there's like a door handle you can pretend you're going to grab, a thing that looks kind of like ringing a bell, so you press that with your finger, and then a spray can implement, some other ones like a can that fell over that you're going to pick up, a pencil that you could grip down at the bottom, or a pencil that you could pick up. So there's lots of really interesting and good evidence that priming has pretty major and interesting effects in these situations. So the one of my favorite ones is that if you are first shown this, let's pick a nice easy example. If you're first shown the hand that suggests you're going to need to grab the spray can, and then that disappears, even if it appears and disappears so quickly that you don't overtly notice it, if then the computer screen commands you to grab the door handle implement, you can see that people actually start off in a kind of spray can hand position before they switch back over to the grabbing the door handle hand position. So we are hugely affected by these things we just barely see. Our motion, our understanding of the world can be hugely affected by things that we perceive, though we do not sense them. Related to this is the effect of habituation. The longer a percept persists out in the world and hitting our sensory receptors, the more used to it we become. You've experienced this a number of times. Maybe you've worn a hat all day, and then you take it off and you feel like you're still wearing a hat. This is the dulling of a sensation after repeated or elongated exposure. You step in too hot a shower and you get used to it. Step in too cold a shower, you get used to it. The reason for this is that your senses are adaptive. You can walk into a place and smell a bad smell, but eventually kind of forget that it's there. You can have a TV on in the background doing its kind of high-pitched whine when it has no signal, and you can kind of lose that in the background of your hearing. There are all kinds of examples of really interesting habituation effects. This website, which I'll share the link to, gives you this particular interesting one where, so my suggestion here is that you get close-ish to your computer screen, not too close, stare at the plus. So if you stare at the plus all the way through one of these cycles, you will become habituated to the inward movement. And so, when the image suddenly switches to a static statue of the Buddha, you will see an expansion in the Buddha's face, or wherever you're focusing. And now I see everything expanding all around me. So you probably had you could have a similar experience if you really focus in on it. Another habituation example is the concept of afterimages, which we actually talked about Fechner having discovered in a recent video. So the way this one works is if you stare at the white plus for a while and then dart your eyes over to the black plus, you'll see an image of a correctly colored American flag appear behind it. So I'll see if I can get it for myself on my second screen here. Yeah, I had to stare for like a good solid 5 seconds and then really dart my eyes over to be able to make it work. But afterimages are another instance of habituation. Your retina habituates to the colors in front of you, your cones habituate in particular, and then when you move over you can see their process of getting used to the colors that are in front of you. Interesting, right? This effect is so strong that it actually works for a far more complicated concept like emotion. So this is these are three faces that are paired together very specifically. The task here is to look very closely at the angry face on the left for 20 to 30 seconds, and then look at the face in the center. I won't do that live for you, but when you do that, when you get used to the angry face and then move to the central face, it probably looks scared to you because you have become adapted to the emotion of the face on the left. To start over then, gaze at the face on the right, the scared face. When you move from that to the center face probably looks a little angry. This is another type, as I said, of visual habituation, and an example of how our perception is very heavily informed by the context surrounding it, by what it has seen recently. Another example here. So to avoid this process, our eyes are constantly and unconsciously moving, tiny bits at a time. I'm blinking, but the reason I'm showing you this video is so you can see those tiny movements. So watch the eye kind of dart around. There we go. There was a little move. That's a big move. Small move. These little moves are called saccades, and they are something our eyes do on purpose to avoid habituation. So again, our eyes are pretty constantly moving. The process is unconscious. They move tiny bits at a time. But you can see it really clearly if you look at, for example, how somebody looks at a face on screen in front of them. Their eye movements typically have a pretty predictable pattern to them, where we'll look at the eyes and the space between the eyes, and we'll look down at the nose and at the mouth and across the mouth and then back up to the nose and to the eyes. These little eye movements are meant to help keep us from habituating, so that we can keep as accurate a image of what's in front of us as possible. This is also why reading is more tiring when print is larger, because you're moving more and you're making more and more saccades. Where people focus their gaze is a really, really interesting question for psychologists to answer. We look at it constantly. There's lots and lots of studies on saccades. If you're curious about this kind of thing, it could be an interesting topic for that first paper you have. Now, this is a demo that works really nicely in a live class, something that we won't really be able to do online, but it could work reasonably well if you choose one or the other of these two sets of anagrams and try to solve them. So if you solve the top set or the bottom set, don't do both, do one or the other. I'll pause. Go ahead and pause me while you do it. Now, the interesting thing here is that these two different sets of anagrams build two different sort of sets of related topics, sets of contexts, categories would probably be the cleanest way to say this. They exist in two different categories, such that the top one is mostly animals. Bull, camel, skunk, mouse, zebra. And so for that last one, you would probably come up with an ape. The second set is mostly vegetables, I think. Corn, onion, tomato, pepper, beet. And so for that last one, it's actually the same thing. It's EAP, but you would probably come up with P, because ape doesn't really fit in that set. And so this concept, or this demo, serves to describe the overarching concept that I want to introduce to you, that kind of describes and explains all of what we've talked about so far, which is the idea of perceptual set. We've talked previously about edges in perception and the particular tuning of neurons in the occipital lobe. And what we've been dealing with today is how the brain and then the mind pieces together all these edges and parts to perceive whole objects. And then those objects, along with what you hear from them and along with what you feel in the air around you, to create an entire experience of a single perception at a single moment. And that is based on, again, our knowledge, the context surrounding us, and our relevant experience. This is how we build perceptual sets. And so the definition of a perceptual set is the mental predisposition to perceive a stimulus as one thing and not another, similar to that von Helmholtz likelihood principle. So there are a couple easy concepts to think about within perceptual set. One is constancy. We tend to think of things as having constant size and constant shape. And so we use information about the constancy of size and shape in objects to determine where those objects are in space. So for example, here, this looks freaky, right? It looks like there is a very tall lady and a very small man. How could they both exist in the same room? Well, the reason it looks like that to us is because we assume that we know that people have constancy in size and shape, and so for them to look so different means that they must be in this strange, smaller scenario, this strange scenario with a very small person. And we are born looking for this. It's not something that humans have learned specifically. It's something that babies are looking for right as soon as they're born. They're looking to sensibly interpret what's around them. They're looking to build and establish rules for their perception so that they can quickly understand things as they come to them the second, third, fourth, millionth time. Babies are actually born and pretty quickly can differentiate figure from ground in drawings or paintings and pictures. They can distinguish the difference between a glass sitting on the table and the table itself. And those aren't things that seem like they should be innate, but they almost are. Like they're learned really, really early if they're not learned from or at birth. And the reason we do this is because it makes the world seem stable. It makes the world seem livable. Imagine if every time you woke up, you'd have to relearn all these rules again. Or imagine if a person walking towards you didn't have smoothness to their movement. They like disappeared and appeared at each movement they made. It would be freaky. It would be impossible to tell where anybody was, or impossible to identify who was around you. You'd be like a T-Rex in a movie, waiting for someone to move to be able to see them. Remember that? Like Jurassic Park, they said their vision's based on movement. I don't know how true that was, but that kind of experience is what I'm trying to describe. And so this process, this concept of perceptual set, these understandings we have of the difference between a figure and the ground, the size constancy of an object, the shape constancy of an object, can sometimes lead to errors. And usually we call these errors visual illusions. You've undoubtedly heard of this before. This is an example. The image here is an example of a visual illusion called the Ames room, A-M-E-S. Makes the woman on the right seem much bigger than the man on the left. And the reason it does that is it uses our assumptions about shapes in a typical room, as well as distances and angles, to form the illusion. So the room is built actually like this. She's standing up higher, the ceiling is sloped down toward her, and you're only able to look in the room from one spot. And then the other thing that goes on is the back wall is slanted, and the images, the picture frames on the back wall are slanted, and the tiles are designed just so that it looks normal to us when we look at it from this one particular angle. But as soon as you see an Ames room from above or from slightly to the side, as in the other image, it starts to, you can start to sort of see your way through the illusion. But in this case, this one is photographed so perfectly that you can't even tell. And again, that's because of our assumptions. Have a look at these two wedges, these two little pictures. Which would you say is bigger? I think I would say the one on the right. And I'll show you that. In fact, they are exactly the same. You can see as I pass it over, first of all, when they passed over top, you can see they were the same. And now the one on the right, which used to be the one on the left, looks bigger. This is called the Wundt-Jastrow illusion. And the question I want you to consider here is, how is it possible that these two identical sensations produce different percepts? There's a huge disagreement here between your sensation and your perception. This particular visual illusion is one in which no one is exactly sure why it happens the way it happens. It probably has something to do with our knowledge of the world in reference to like sort of scooped shapes like this, maybe. The comparison between the inner edge and the outer edge of a shape. Not sure. I don't know. Here's another cool one. This is the Necker cube. What do you see when you look at this? Do you see the cube, or do you just see a bunch of circles with lines cut out of them? You probably see the cube, right? And if you stare at the cube, you can probably try to make it move. You can make it reverse itself. So if as you look at it, the tiny X in the center is on the front edge. See if you can flip it to have that tiny X be on the back edge. Can you do it? I did it. Hooray. You can kind of imagine maybe the cube is floating in front of the screen with the circles behind it, or you could maybe imagine that the circles are holes cut into the screen and you can see the cube through them. There's so much more to perception than we think about on a daily basis. Or said in pure dad joke format, there's a lot more to perception than meets the eye. So let's talk about the Gestalt theories of perception here. First of all, Gestalt is German for shape. This was a school of thought in German psychology quite a long time ago, And it's based on the idea that the mind organizes percepts into reasonable groups based on past experience. So the things, the objects in front of you are organized into some kind of grouping based on what you know and what you've seen before. So we look for typical forms or shapes that we recognize. We look for information about depth, and we understand the fact that objects typically don't change what they are. They stay the same. They are constant. This is based on the German concept of Prägens, which is the idea that the world is orderly, simple, and symmetrical. First three Gestalt theories of perception. Number one here, proximity. We group nearby figures together. You probably don't see 6 lines here. You probably see 3 sets of 2 lines. Yes, that's the law of proximity. Second one here, continuity. We perceive smooth, continuous patterns rather than discontinuous ones. You don't see a bunch of semicircles lined up here. You see a line, a straight line, and a wavy line crossing each other. Continuity. Another one is closure. We fill in gaps to create a complete whole object. You probably don't see these as 3 little Pac-Men. You see them as a triangle sitting on top of 3 squares. That's the concept of closure. We assume that the circles are completed, but are just blocked by the triangle that actually doesn't exist, right? It's not outlined, it's not there. Fitting in with the Gestalt theories of perception are shape and size constancy. We assume, due to what we know about the world around us and our ability to perceive depth, that objects of different shapes or sizes are probably objects we know, just looked at slightly differently, from a different angle, from a different distance, in a different context. And it's the same basic story for color constancy. So all of these images don't look like tiny doors or parallelogram doors to you. It looks like a door far away, a door up closer, and doors slightly open. Another example of the law of proximity is shown here, and then the last Gestalt piece of perception I want to show you is called common fate. So here is an array of 5 dots. They're going to move. Watch for them to move. Now they are still an array of 5 dots, but you could probably put them in 2 groups visually, the 2 groups that moved together. So we see things that move together as having a common fate. These instantaneous perceptions, this effort to perceive things quickly, the goal of the cognitive system to speed up cognition makes good sense, both evolutionarily and biologically. Imagine you encounter a stranger in the forest. You have to pretty quickly assess whether that person is going to be friend or foe. Should I be happy to see this person, or should I be afraid of this person? If you read the expression of that person accurately, you're probably more likely to survive. So the evolutionary interpretation would be, long time ago, when we were actually running into each other in the woods very frequently and trying to assess whether we were friends or foes, the people who read those emotional signals on each other's faces more accurately were able to survive longer and thus reproduce more, and so it evolutionarily became something we were very, very good at. So good, in fact, that we can typically interpret emotion in a face in less than 200 milliseconds, and the utility of an object in about 200 milliseconds as well. It's a really short amount of time. It's like 0.2 of a second, and it also is quicker than we can typically fully perceive an object in our minds. So we can assess whether something is useful or whether a person is a threat before we even really fully feel like we have looked at them. We also have experiences like loving or hating a painting at first sight. You can know why you feel this way about a particular piece of artwork, but you can't describe it. That's that kind of thin slicing experience that is the same as our interpretations of emotions or utilities of objects. Our first impressions of each other are a big, big deal. The impression you have of a new job candidate or of a new roommate or of any new person you meet is made in the first couple of seconds that you talk to that person. That's why in job interviews we talk about how important it is to make a really good first impression. Literally, the way you walk in the room, unfortunately, communicates a lot to the person interviewing you, and causes them to interpret your utility. So, I've sort of described why we do this, why we've developed this way, but why have we gone so far that we can kind of lead ourselves astray into illusions and leave ourselves in a place where we have all these kind of inconvenient extra percepts? And I'll leave you with that question. Why are we so designed? Why do we have such a system so built to speed things up? Why has it gone so intensely that it leads us astray in some of these situations? Part of the answer to that is that, well, psychologists have looked for ways to fool it so that we can learn about the system. But there are instances in the real world in which it is also maladaptive. So it's worth thinking about, worth considering instances in which your quick, thin slice perceptions should be maybe challenged. And now that we've gone all the way through the perception unit, you can probably very nicely and clearly answer this final question. Why can you read this? And which top-down process is it pertaining to? We're definitely looking at an instance of word perception here, and the fact that in word perception we typically first analyze or first sort of take our thin slice based on the first and last letter in the word. So all the words you're looking at here have the correct first and last letter. It's just everything inside that's jumbled up. That's why it's possible to read, because we know words so well, we have such clear knowledge about what words typically show up, we can come to conclusions about them even if the middle is all garbled. Thanks for watching this video. It got kind of long, and we'll talk to you again soon.